Hi, we're going to view from here. I'm Matt Driskill, live, sort of, in Singapore. That's right, we made a big move from Hong Kong a long time ago, and we're now broadcasting live, sort of, from Singapore. Today we are continuing the FCC Speaker Series. We're getting caught up on our speeches. The topic today, when the party ends, China's leaps and stumbles after the Beijing Olympics. The speaker, Peh Shing Huei, he's a journalist with the Straits Times here in Singapore. A little bit more about him in just a minute. Many of you know the FCC in Hong Kong. Many of you know it's a key stop on the itineraries of the most well-known people in the world who happen to be passing through the city. The view from here is pleased to announce we've got the complete set of speeches dating all the way back to 2007. We've got more online than the club itself, and we're uploading each and every speech from 2013 as fast as we can. Speakers and topics in the series include people like Mia Farrow, famous actress, outspoken activist on China and Darfur. We've got Bill Clinton, old Slick Willie, in conversation with Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern-day Singapore, the soft rock capital of the world. And we've got people like Chris Patton, the last governor of Hong Kong before it was handed back to China. We've also got people like comedian, author Michael Palin of Monty Python fame, and we've got many, many more. Check back frequently on The View From Here to get the latest podcast. Don't forget, you can also log on to iTunes and subscribe to The View From Here. That way you won't miss a key speech. Just go to the iTunes store, do a search for me, Matt Driskill, or The View From Here, and subscribe. And that way each and every speech will be downloaded straight to your iPod, your iPhone, your iPad. A little bit more about today's offering, the topic, When the Party Ends, China's Leaps and Stumbles After the Beijing Olympics. It's a new book by journalist Peh Shing Huei. He's with the Straits Times here in Singapore. According to the propaganda I've been handed, he will talk about his new books, which captures his harrowing, humbling, and sometimes hilarious experiences in a communist country that favors free markets. His 5 years as China bureau chief for the Straits Times from 2008 to 2012 correspond with a China on the move, on the ascent, and at times in tumult. It was a time when China stunned the world with the opening of the Beijing Olympics 3 months after the Sichuan earthquake. Tough way to pronounce these words. Helped calm the economic fallout of Wall Street's collapse and launched astronauts into space. From his travels across China, Peh chronicles the vivid accounts of questionable processes against the voiceless and the powerless. He shakes off officials to meet an environmentalist who was tortured for wanting to save a river from pollution. He talks to a man who was jailed simply for posting an intemperate tweet. And he interviews an aging former Red Guard undertaker who still cries when he recalls the atrocities of the Mao era. These vignettes are counterposed against Peh's views from the palace intrigues of communist leaders in the lead-up to the leadership change in 2012, including the downfall of the princeling Bo Xilai. As I said, Peh Shing Huei is a journalist for the Straits Times here in Singapore. He's the newspaper's deputy news editor. He's also the co-author of Struck by Lightning, which is a collection of essays on Singapore politics. Well, that's it for me, Matt Driskill. That's The View From Here. Stay tuned. The topic, When the Party Ends, China's Leaps and Stumbles After the Beijing Olympics. The speaker, Mr. Peh Shing Huei of the Straits Times here in Singapore. He is next.
The club to talk about her amazing career. And Enzio Fonfale, an investment advisor, will be here on the 26th to talk about how investors should navigate the many challenges of the Asian currency markets. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Peh Shing Huei, who is Deputy News Editor at the Straits Times in Singapore. He was Beijing correspondent from 2008 to 2012, and his new book, which is available near the exit, is on his many observations in his 5 years living in Beijing. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Peh to the club.
Thank you, Enid. Very honored to be here with the FCC. I must say that this is the first time I'm in this building, and I came in about an hour ago. I was suitably envious. For years, being a part of the FCC in Beijing, we're deemed an illegal organization by the Chinese government, and so clearly we have no home. And finding a venue for talks like this was always quite a chore, quite tricky to find someone willing to host us. So suitably impressed coming to this wonderful, really beautiful building that you have here, and very, very glad to be able to talk about my new book, When the Party Ends, China's Leaps and Stumbles After the Beijing Olympics. So I launched this book about 2 weeks ago in Singapore, and quite a few people came up to me and said that it's a great title. You know, they find it eye-catching, sounds exciting. But invariably, many of them follow up by asking, which party are you talking about? So, given that I come from Singapore, where we also have a really dominant party, so questions, quite a few doubts about exactly what party I'm referring to. So just to clarify here that the party that I'm referring to is China's coming out party, otherwise known as the Beijing Olympics of 2008. I hope I have not disappointed those of you who came here hoping for a talk on the other party. Maybe a bit late to ask for a refund, but you're stuck with me for the next few minutes. So, I thought it might be useful for me to say a little bit about how I came to write this book and why I wrote it, which will then bring me into what this book is all about. And in order to do it, let me bring you back to the year 2008 in China. And the story of China in 2008 is really all about the Beijing Olympics in August. That was China's coming out party. That was the event that the whole country was building up to. Some of you may remember that China actually tried to host the Olympics earlier and lost out to Sydney. So this was the second bid, and it won. It's a big deal to the country. And so when this party is over, pretty much like most of us after a party, you feel somewhat tired, want a little bit of quiet time, maybe even having a slight hangover. And so the talk in Beijing and the talk in China really after the Beijing Olympics is one of a quieter country, really one preferring to take stock and maybe just chill a little bit, you know. Let's not forget that in 2008, China also went through the Sichuan earthquake. That was in May 2008, and the worst natural disaster the country has ever been through in decades. So having been through a very traumatic event like this, followed by a major event like the Beijing Olympics, the talk in Beijing was really, let's take things down a little bit. So you find foreign correspondents, for instance, are being recalled, you know. We see fewer of our colleagues there, especially after the financial crisis. And with that, I must say that is a narrative that kind of stayed with me over the next few years after 2008. You know, the journalists among you might be able to identify with this because there you are chasing news, covering the events, and sometimes we don't quite take a step back and look at the big picture of just how the country has transformed, how the country has changed. And that's pretty much how I was as a foreign correspondent in Beijing, you know, chasing the news, getting my bylines every day. And then this went on till right about the spring of 2012, at the height of the Peh Shing Huei scandal, which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with. So I was out on the job interviewing a key supporter of Peh Shing Huei. And there I met a fellow foreign correspondent from the United States. So, you know, like all foreign correspondents, we exchange notes, you know, oh, when do you get here and how's things been? And so she asked me, so when you get here? And I said, oh, 2008, before the Beijing Olympics. And I said, well, you know, when the party ends. And then her reply was, no, that's when the party started. I was somewhat taken aback by that comment because, like I said, you know, for the past few years, between 2008 and up till that point, I was thinking really of a China that has kind of gotten quieter. The story was China was all about the build-up to the Beijing Olympics. But her comment got me thinking, got me wondering that, indeed, after the Beijing Olympics, a lot of things happened in China. So I went back to my notebooks, took a look at the stuff that I've taken down, took a look at the stories I've written, and indeed, I realized that a lot of things have happened. Not only that, a sort of a new narrative was actually forming after the Beijing Olympics, and if I can sum it up, it would be a more assertive China overseas and an increasingly fragile China at home. And more importantly, I realized that, looking back at my notes, that just between the end of the Olympics in August 2008 and the end of the year, those 4 months, actually there were clues that were sprinkled across China to tell us what to expect in the years to come. Let me just run through a few of them. The financial crisis. 3 weeks after the Beijing Olympics, 22 days to be specific, Lehman Brothers collapse. So symbolically, and I stress symbolically, in a matter of 3 weeks, it seems that China has reached the peak with the Olympics, and the West has descended into one of its darkest recessions ever. This was followed up 2 months later in November 2008 with a massive 4 trillion yuan stimulus package by the Chinese government. Now, this was much sought after in a way by the global markets. Everyone was just waiting to see how China would respond to the financial crisis. And when Beijing released this, it was seen as, wow, the savior has come to the rescue of the world. So China looked good. China felt good. More than that, China looked good in terms of technological advances after the Beijing Olympics. A month after the Games ended, China took its first spacewalk with this man, Zhai Zhigang, making it only the 3rd country after the Soviet Union and the United States to be able to pull off a spacewalk. So one could say that things were looking good for China in those few months towards the end of 2008. But at the same time, cracks were appearing in the country. Cracks which would later widen in the next few years. And these are some of the clues of some of the problems that China would face right after 2008. First, this man, Bo Xilai. For most of the rest of the world, the story of Bo Xilai really was the story of his downfall. We paid attention to him, say, from early 2012 onwards, when the whole scandal erupted. Everyone paid attention because there was sex, there was corruption, there was even murder thrown in. But the story of Bo Xilai in China started, especially in Chongqing, right about the time of 2008. And I would just like to point to one instance. In November 2008, there was a massive strike by taxi drivers in Chongqing, unhappy with pirate cabs, gas prices. So what did Bo Xilai do? Most Chinese leaders would choose to crack down, or maybe have a closed-door dialogue with the strikers. No. Bo Xilai invited them to a dialogue and broadcast it live. There was a big indication to those of us in China that this man, Bo Xilai, is someone different. Is someone who's going to be challenging in some ways the orthodoxy of the Chinese Communist Party. So he had this live broadcast of a dialogue with taxi drivers, and he did it really well. He charmed them off. He made jokes about himself of how he wasn't able to understand the Chongqing dialect too good, and it was all his fault. Self-deprecating even. So that was an instance of some problems which we will later see in 2012 and 2013 within the Communist Party. But beyond that, China was facing renewed stress on its human rights records. In December, Charter 08, a manifesto pushing for democratic reforms, changes, was uploaded online and headed by this man, Liu Xiaobo. He was very quickly arrested, and the public has not seen Liu Xiaobo since. Most of you would know that he was then sentenced, and subsequently, largely because of his sentencing and the Charter 08, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, becoming the first Chinese citizen to win the Nobel Prize. That was an indication of just how hard the Chinese government would come down on any challenges at home. Mind you, up till that point, Liu Xiaobo has already been in prison 3 times. And if we combine the time he spent in prison out of those 3 sentences, it came up to about 5 years. For this alone, he was sentenced to 11 years, which was a major surprise to most observers at that time. Beyond that, food safety. So towards the end of the Olympic Games, the major milk scandal came out. Most of you will remember the melamine milk scandal. Hundreds and thousands of children left with kidney problems, 6 died. And from then on, we saw China struggling with a food safety record, and you could say till today, they still have not completely recovered. So taken together, we see China that is emerging in a way from the Beijing Olympics, stronger on one hand, more fragile on the other. I would like to read out 2 quotes here, which I captured in my book of 2 scholar and official from China, that sum up this transition pretty well. The first is this man Chen Jian, who is the former Chinese ambassador to Japan. And I'll just read out his quote for those at the back who might not be able to read this out. He said, and I quote, "2 major events occurred in 2008, changing how the people of China and the United States look at themselves and each other. The 2 events are China's Olympic Games and financial tsunami in the US. On the one hand, the successful hosting of the Olympics in Beijing demonstrated to the world the prosperity of China after 30 years of reform and opening up, showcased the patriotism of the Chinese people, and illustrated the capabilities of the CCP's leadership. On the other hand, the outbreak of the financial tsunami and the US inability to shake off the shadows of decline allowed the world to reappraise its only superpower. The US is beginning to degenerate. China is looking like it will surpass Japan and catch up with the US. It will become the world's next superpower, and such recognition has been floating, fermenting, and spreading around the world." A very rah-rah quote, gung-ho, full of confidence. Now that's him. Allow me to read another quote, which is less optimistic. This man, Sun Liping, a very prominent thinker in China, Tsinghua University professor, and perhaps most well known for being the PhD advisor to Xi Jinping. What did Sun Liping say? "I've long thought that the impact of the Beijing Olympics on China was very deep, much more than a matter of dollars and cents. The highly cautious attitude of the leadership in facing such a grand event of this kind profoundly impacted China's historical path even afterward. The Olympics marked the beginning, it can be said, of the ascendance of the stability preservation regime in China. Looking back now, it might be the Olympics or something with it that we ought not to have done." So 2 quotes, which I thought sum up this whole pivot of China after the Olympics pretty well. Taken together, that is what my book tries to capture. The book is divided into 3 sections. The first, I look at the rise of China. So this supersized panda. In this first section, I look at how China built new technology, like the space race that we just saw, high-speed rail, as well as the mega events after the Beijing Olympics. That was the first part. The second part was the 60th National Day. And the third, the Shanghai World Expo in 2010. That's at home. Overseas, China started flexing its muscles a lot more. And I examined its relations with ASEAN over the South China Sea in particular, with Japan over the Diaoyudao incidents and Senkakus, and even when it comes to climate change and how China really showed that it was not prepared to back down at the Copenhagen Climate Change Summit in late 2009. That is the rise of China. Second section of the book, I look at the fragility of China. This picture is taken by me in 2009 in Urumqi, Xinjiang, during the riots of Urumqi that killed nearly 200 people. So just looking at the mass incidents, as the Chinese government like to call it, in China after 2008, we'll find that there are actually 4 major events every year. 2009, we have this, the Urumqi riots, showcasing the ethnic problems which China continue to face today. That's 1. 2, 2010, we see major labor unrest across southern China, something which perhaps many of you are quite familiar with, that led to increases in the minimum wage across the country. Third, 2011, the Chinese Jasmine Revolution. There was a call online for China to have its version of the Arab Spring. It didn't amount to much, but that call got the Chinese government really worried and really concerned. And the foreign correspondents in Beijing would be able to tell you of the kind of trouble, in a way, that we were put through by the Chinese government during this period. Last 2012, the Peh Shing Huei incident that brought us into the leadership transition. The third part is when I talk about a party which is not a party in the title, the Chinese Communist Party. And I devote 2 chapters to Peh Shing Huei. First chapter to his rise, and the second chapter to his fall. Reason because I find the rise of Peh Shing Huei as fascinating as the fall of Peh Shing Huei, because to understand the fall of Peh Shing Huei, you actually really need to know how he managed to package himself, how he managed to market himself, all the way that somehow contributed to his downfall. Then I go into the leadership transition, the 18th Party Congress late last year, and how we saw a new leadership team under this man, Xi Jinping. Taken together, these 3 parts, the rise of China, the fragility of China, and the Chinese Communist Party, a central player that pretty much run through China's story, is what I would call the story of China when the party ends. So I hope we can have an interesting discussion now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pei. That's a very convincing narrative that you've drawn up. And now we have about just over 15 minutes for Q&A from the floor. I see a hand there already. Please wait for the microphone. And perhaps tell us your name, please.
Oh, hello. Thank you for the speech. I'm Houghton Lee, the member of the FCC. In my past experience in China, when I contacted different officials in China, and also even officers in Hong Kong SAR, in a different occasion, they show some aspiration and admiration for the social political model of Singapore. In the sense, then they have a very strong one-party rule with a strong grip of power, but at the same time, is still overseeing a very dynamic, open, and prosperous economy. And most important, there's a very low level of the corruption and a very highly efficient, executive branch. And do you feel that actually there are many top, cadets in China really want to try to emulate what Singapore have done? And do you think that the Singapore model can be transplanted to the China mainland? And also, can it be transplanted to Hong Kong over here? Yeah.
Thank you for the question. It is true that the Chinese Communist Party is very keen to learn from Singapore and to find out how Singapore has been able to pull off this story of a free economy but a less free political system. They have sent many officials, thousands and thousands of officials to our university, and we actually set up classes dedicated to teach them in a way about the Singapore system. But if I can just quote a very senior Singapore diplomat who told me that they keep sending officials over because they somehow remain unconvinced that we have told them everything. And so they keep wanting to know just what exactly is the secret of success. And our response from the Singapore government has been that we have shown you everything. This is it. This is how we do it. But they remain unconvinced. And I think that there are fundamental differences between the two systems, which perhaps the Chinese government either is unwilling to adopt or unable to adopt. When the Singapore Prime Minister went to Beijing at Dang Xiao, at the Central Party School, and he gave a speech, I believe it was in 2005, and again, this was pointed out, the similarities between the two systems, and the Singapore Prime Minister very quickly answered and said, there's one big fundamental difference. We have elections, you don't. And that is one big difference between the two countries. The Singapore government has free and regular elections, which allows it to have the legitimacy that the Chinese Communist Party is struggling with today. So that, I think, is, unless the Communist Party is willing to go down that way, it's going to be very difficult for them to replicate the Singapore system in China. But more than that, Singapore is a city-state. To adapt this to a gigantic country like China, I think is not likely to happen. In China, you face all sorts of problems which you will not find in Singapore. Rural-urban tension. That's a very easy example, and just the sheer scale of the problems that you face in China. The amount of cars in Beijing alone is more than the number of people in Singapore. So to make that comparison, I think is tricky. And I think that is what the Chinese government has been trying to emphasize to the Singapore government, rather, has been trying to emphasize to the Chinese side. As for whether it can be adapted for Hong Kong, I guess maybe you guys are in a better position to answer that than me. But as my old friend and colleague here, Ching Chong, pointed out earlier when we were having lunch, that there's a major difference in that between Singapore and Hong Kong, and that Singapore is an independent nation, whereas Hong Kong isn't. So Singapore and Singaporeans are able to decide how we want to proceed with our country in a way which I think so far the Hong Kong people are unable to. So, for instance, immigration is a major problem for both Hong Kong and from Singapore. And it was such a big problem for Singapore that during the last general election, which was 2 years ago, that I would say it cost the Singapore ruling party quite a few votes. And because of that, because the voters were able to tell the Singapore government that we're unhappy with the immigration policy at home, it forced the government to change. I'm not sure if that's possible in Hong Kong yet, and I'm not sure if that has, whether the immigration policy here with regards to mainlanders coming in has changed. That is, I would say, a fundamental difference between Singapore and Hong Kong, which makes this adapting rather tricky. Thank you.
Joe?
That was really interesting, and I do appreciate very much you're dedicating 2 chapters to Bo Xilai. It's kind of difficult to talk about Bo Xilai without making some reference to Wang Lijun, the guy that blew the whistle, the guy that raced to the American consulate, became a political football inside of the Beltway with Republicans beating up Obama for throwing him under the bus. What was he going to do, for God's sakes? He had Xi coming into Washington, D.C. a week later. Had no choice, but with the cooperation of the people in Beijing, they rescued him. The question I have to you is, would you speculate on where he is? Will he be allowed to be resurrected and forgiven for the sin of going to the American consulate? Surely there must be people that would like to see him. He's a hero to some and a traitor to others. What's going to happen to Wang Lijun, out of curiosity?
Thank you. Wang Lijun, you could say, got off with a fairly light sentence considering the crimes that he committed. He was only sentenced to 15 years. And the speculation or the conspiracy theory has been that he cooperated with the CCP in Beijing, and he gave them useful details to bring down Bo Xilai, and hence he got away with 15 years. I think when Wang Lijun was sentenced last year, really the surprise was just how light the sentence was. 15 years, the guy may be out by in 8 years or so, for good behavior and stuff like that. I don't believe that he has a second chance for a political career, because Wang Lijun, after all, is pretty much low down the food chain, and he hitched his political career very much with Bo Xilai. So with the end of Bo Xilai, I don't think anyone would really want to touch Wang Lijun. But having said that, he could be released a lot sooner than we thought, and maybe allowed to live a fairly peaceful life. And considering the controversy that he started, it's a fairly good deal, I would say.
Can I just ask, your book finished with a section on the new leadership of Beijing, and we've just seen the conclusion of the third plenum meeting. What's your takeaway from the meeting? Does it leave you more optimistic or more pessimistic about reform in China?
The meeting you're referring to is the third plenum or the leadership? The third plenum, okay. I think what the latest meeting suggests is that Xi Jinping clearly is a far, far stronger leader than Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao spent his first few years really struggling to assert himself, struggling to be a leader, a clear leader. And in Beijing, it was what we say is that he has one too many mother-in-laws. So hovering over Hu Jintao for the first few years of his leadership of the Communist Party, something which I think we don't see with Xi Jinping. And this latest meeting confirms that to a certain extent, that indeed Xi Jinping has a lot more power. The fact that now he has this big state security committee, and he was able to push through some pretty interesting changes, like the relaxation to the hukou, the relaxation to the one-child policy, suggests that one, he is willing to do something, and two, he is able to push through with it. And so I would be fairly optimistic about the role of Xi Jinping in a way, in terms of what he will be able to do, as compared to, say, the Hu Wen administration, where a lot of complaints, especially in the second term, has been their unwillingness or inability to really do anything. Clearly something needed to be fixed, and yet not enough was being done.
Wing?
Since you mentioned him, Xi, what do you think his chances are in rooting out corruption? I doubt if China will ever eliminate corruption totally, but how much progress do you think he'll make in even starting on rooting out corruption? Or
I would say that corruption is quite easily the most serious problem facing the Chinese Communist Party today. His inability to deal with it would probably be the reason for his downfall eventually, if it should happen. And conversely, if he's able to deal with it, I think that it might rule for many, many more years. But can Xi eradicate corruption? I'm not optimistic, because I think that corruption in China is so well entrenched, is so pervasive, is so much a way of life that I just can't see how he's able to do it. He's going to make some big moves, Bo Xilai being one, Jiang Zemin being the other. He's going to make some big moves. He's going to impress quite a lot of people. But to really eradicate it, to really change, I'm not so optimistic. I mean, in China, if you send a kid to school, that you would need to pay the teacher just for the teacher to get your kid to answer questions. You would actually need to give hongbao. You need to give red packets so that your kid will be called on to answer questions. Corruption has been that entrenched, and the amount of money that you need to pay to send your kid to a particular school is exorbitant, is crazy. And when during the annual 中秋节, the Mid-Autumn Festival in Beijing is those 2 weeks leading up to the Mid-Autumn Festival are the 2 weeks that hit the most in China, because the traffic condition in Beijing is crazy. And the traffic is crazy because everyone is going out delivering mooncakes. And the reason why they're delivering mooncakes, because clearly it's not the mooncakes, it's the stuff that comes with the mooncakes that everyone is sending to everyone. And when you look at the amount of traffic that picks up in those 2 weeks leading up to the Mid-Autumn Festival, that tells you just how well oiled this whole corruption machinery is in China, and how pervasive it is. And one wonders how someone like Xi, even with the best of intentions, can possibly solve this problem.
So what's going to happen? I mean, a lot of people, I suppose, are aware that the anger about how entrenched corruption is in China is what is spurring a lot of local level demonstrations, right? A lot of protests. And we've just seen what happened in Tiananmen Square, where the Uyghurs caused a lot of injuries and death by using a rather violent and extreme mean to express their anger. How do you think that the party really can just keep a lid on all this anger indefinitely?
I think clearly the party will struggle, but having said that, it seems to be a party that has struggled pretty well. So a figure that has often been cited when talking about protests in China is one that was given by the man I quoted earlier, Sun Liping, the Tsinghua University professor. He gave the figure of 180,000 protests a year in China, in mainland China, a figure obviously that is not given by the government. So his is probably as official as it gets. So when many of us look at 180,000 and you go, okay, this clearly is a regime that is in trouble, because you divide it by 365, there's so many happening a year. But on the other hand, if you just take a step back and look at that and go, if there are 180,000 protests and their unhappiness, their grievances ranged from anything from land grab, corruption, official abuse, ethnic problems, labor issues. There's so much. There is such a wide range of issues that most of them can't really come together to form one single thread to the ruling party. So as long as there's this multitude of grievances, as long as there's this wide range of protests on very, very different things in very, very different parts of China, and they don't coalesce into one force, I think the Chinese Communist Party is quite happy to let it go along. And by the way, out of this 180,000 protests, a vast majority, I would say about 80 to 90%, is resolved within a day. So looking at that figure alone might be rather daunting and seem rather pessimistic. But on the other hand, if you analyze it a little bit further, it may not actually be that bleak. Thank you.
Douglas?
What do you think of the way that China is dealing with the foreign media right now? I mean, obviously, 2008, the Coming Out Party, China made a lot of commitments about giving access to journalists. I think most of us would think that the trend has not been positive since then. It's in the news a lot like right now. But what's your opinion of how China is dealing with the international media? Do you think it's the right way to deal with the international media? And how do you think the international media should respond?
I'm in total agreement with you. I think that when it comes to the foreign correspondence in China, the party really ended with the Olympics. Since then, it's been just going downhill. And one of the worst examples would be the Chinese Jasmine Revolution that I mentioned earlier. So just to give some quick background, nothing much really came out of this Chinese Jasmine Revolution. There were no protests, there was nothing. In fact, when at the places in Beijing where protesters were supposed to gather, you find more journalists than protesters. There were hardly any protesters to begin with, So there we were, 50 of us foreign journalists just coming out with nothing much to report. But what got in the press the next day was really how the security people manhandled us. They dragged us away, they carried us away, some were assaulted even, and those were the unfortunate ones. For myself, for instance, so I was called up to the security office, reminded that I should not cover this protest. I was visited at home on a weekend with no notice whatsoever, and warned that I should obey China's laws and stuff like that. So that was one instance where it was very clear that the Chinese government was not about to play nice with any of us, and they were hard. That was one example. Beyond that, visas have been increasingly hard to come by. So some of you here will be quite familiar. Chris Barkley, for instance, is still here in Hong Kong and waiting for his visa to get back to the mainland. So recently we just saw Paul Mooney, another very esteemed foreign correspondent who spent more than 2 decades in China, having his visa renewal denied. So it's getting harder and harder to come by. And most of us, the foreign correspondents, don't really know what to do. What kind of avenues do we have to actually try to press the Chinese government to be nicer to us, I would say. And coming back to the earlier point about the FCC, the years after the Beijing Olympics, the FCC in China was, the board members in particular, were really harassed. And there was one year in particular, I said, that the president of the FCC was close to getting his visa denied until he agreed to pretty much pull out of FCC, and I think his visa was only renewed on New Year's Eve. Those are the kind of circumstances that we had to live with, and it certainly wasn't pleasant in any way at all.
We're about to run out of time, but just a very quick question. Comparing your time in Beijing and what you're doing now as deputy news editor in Singapore, which regime of censorship is easier to navigate?
Is that the last question?
Yes.
It's very different. Operating in China as a foreign correspondent, you're dealing with a regime with media control, I would say, that is perhaps not as sophisticated, not as refined, and hence they would do things like visiting you at home unannounced, and they would trace your movements. And so that makes working in China as a foreign correspondent tricky. When it comes to Singapore, I think that there was a talk here last month by Dr. Charon George talking about Singapore's media controls. So most of you will be fairly familiar with what he said and the media model in Singapore. And I would say that controls would be a lot more sophisticated, a lot more refined than what Dr. George referred to as calibrated coercion. You don't really feel it in your daily work, and hence it is not as overt, it is not as in your face, but clearly is in a realm of laws, and Singapore's media model is pretty much set in stone in many ways since the 1970s, and those are the parameters that we have to work with. But in a good way, you know what you're dealing with because it's out there. It's set out there. It's in your laws. So you know what you have to navigate in Singapore. Whereas I think that in China, very often, you don't know what you have to deal with. And if you should stray, to use a very Singapore term, if you should stray out of bounds, you have no idea what might hit you too. So because of that, I would say operating in China carries with it greater danger, if you would. But of course, as journalists, it means somewhat greater excitement as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peh.
Thank you.
Let me present to you a souvenir from the club.